Babylon, 323 BC, the greatest city on earth, and inside it, the greatest conqueror who ever lived, is dying. Outside the palace walls, tens of thousands of soldiers wait in silence, veterans of 1,000 battles, men who crossed deserts, climbed mountains, crossed the edge of the known world for him. They wait because they don't know what else to do without him. Inside, his generals crowd the doorways, whispering, calculating. Their king cannot speak, cannot name a successor. The empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India, the largest the world has ever seen, has no one to inherit it. He is 32 years old. In 13 years, this man reshaped the entire map of the ancient world. He never lost a battle, not one, not ever. He stood against armies of 100,000 men and walked off the field victorious. And yet, here, in a palace in Babylon, with no wound to blame and no enemy to face, he is losing. How does a man conquer the world and lose it overnight?
To understand Alexander, you first have to understand his father. Philip II of Macedon was not a man you underestimated, not twice anyway. He took a fractured, disrespected kingdom on the northern fringe of Greece and forged it into the most formidable military machine the ancient world had produced. He invented new tactics. He built the phalanx into something terrifying. He unified Greece not with diplomacy alone, but with an iron fist wrapped in the thinnest possible silk glove. Philip was a conqueror, a genius, a force of nature. And Alexander grew up in his shadow, determined to exceed him. From the beginning, there were signs. At 13 years old, while Philip's horsemasters struggled with a wild stallion no one could tame, a horse that reared and screamed and threw every rider, young Alexander walked forward. He had noticed the horse was terrified of its own shadow. He turned the animal toward the sun, mounted it calmly. He named it Bucephalus. He would ride it for 20 years to the very edge of the known world. Philip reportedly wept watching his son that day. He told him, "Macedonia is too small for you. Seek a larger kingdom." Philip was not wrong, but he would not live to see how large. To sharpen that restless mind, Philip hired the greatest intellect alive, Aristotle. For 3 years, the philosopher and the prince sat together in the gardens of Mysa. Aristotle taught him philosophy, medicine, rhetoric, science, and above all, how to think, how to adapt, how to see patterns in chaos. Alexander would carry a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, with him on every campaign. He slept with it under his pillow, alongside a dagger, a book, and a blade. That was Alexander. But in 336 BC, everything changed. At a celebration in Aegae, Philip II was assassinated, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. The reasons remain debated to this day: personal grievance, Persian gold, political conspiracy, perhaps even whispers of Alexander's mother Olympias pulling strings in the shadows. It doesn't matter who ordered it. What matters is what it meant. A 20-year-old boy, not yet proven in command, suddenly held the throne of Macedon, and every enemy his father had ever made, every Greek city-state, every neighboring kingdom, every rival faction within his own court, saw an opportunity. They thought he was young. They thought he was inexperienced. They thought grief would break him. They were wrong about all of it.
Alexander moved before anyone expected him to, before the rumors could become rebellions, before the conspiracies could become coups. He executed his rivals at home, secured the Macedonian nobility, and then marched south into Greece with such terrifying speed that city after city submitted before raising a spear. Almost all of them. Thebes thought differently. The city of Thebes, one of the proudest in all of Greece, home of Epaminondas, birthplace of Heracles himself, rose in open rebellion. They believed the reports that Alexander was dead. They believed they had their moment. They were catastrophically mistaken. Alexander arrived at their walls not with negotiation, not with terms. He arrived with an army and a fury that the ancient world had not yet seen from him. He gave the city one chance to surrender. They refused. He tore Thebes apart. 6,000 killed in the assault, 30,000 sold into slavery, the walls pulled down stone by stone, the temples spared, the house of the poet Pindar spared because Alexander admired his verses. Everything else gone. The message echoed across every corner of the Greek world instantly. This was not Philip, who conquered with patience and politics. This was something else, something younger, something colder. Greece went quiet. Alexander turned east. In 334 BC, Alexander led his army to the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. 32,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, supplies for 30 days. He stood at the bow of his ship as it crossed, and when it reached the Asian shore, he drove his spear into the ground. He claimed the continent. The Persian Empire he faced was not a weakened enemy. Darius III ruled the largest empire on earth, stretching from Egypt to the borders of India. 100 different peoples, armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, resources that dwarfed anything Alexander could muster. On paper, this was not a fair fight. Alexander knew that. He planned accordingly. The first real test came at the Granicus River. Persian cavalry lined the far bank. His generals urged caution. The crossing was dangerous, the position unfavorable. Alexander crossed anyway, immediately, without hesitation. He nearly died. A Persian nobleman raised his sword over Alexander's head and was killed by one of his companions at the last instant. Alexander kept fighting. The Persians broke. The road into Asia opened. Then came Issus. 333 BC, a narrow coastal plain in what is now southern Turkey. Darius himself took the field, with an army that massively outnumbered the Macedonians. He believed the terrain would neutralize Alexander's tactics. He was wrong about that, too. Alexander identified the weakness in the Persian center immediately. He led the companion cavalry, his personal strike force, in a hammer blow aimed directly at Darius himself. The Persian line cracked. Darius fled the field in his royal chariot, abandoning his own family, his wife, his mother, his daughters in his camp. Alexander captured them. He treated them with complete respect. He sent Darius's mother she could still call his queen's quarters a palace. He sent word to Darius, "I will not harm your family, but the throne is mine now." Darius didn't believe him. He should have. Then came the battle that decided the ancient world. Gaugamela, 331 BC, open desert near what is now northern Iraq. Darius had chosen the ground himself, flat, wide, perfect for his vast cavalry, his scythed chariots, his war elephants. He had his men level the earth to make it flawless. He had an army that ancient sources estimated at over 1 million men. Modern historians say far fewer, but still, perhaps 250,000, against Alexander's 47,000. The night before the battle, Alexander slept soundly.
His general Parmenion found him unconscious before dawn, the whole army awake and anxious, and had to wake the king himself. Alexander opened his eyes, completely calm. "What is there to be anxious about," he said, "when the battle is already won?" The next morning he proved it. The Macedonian phalanx held the Persian center like an iron wall. The Persian chariots charged, and the infantry simply opened lanes and let them through, cutting the drivers down from the sides. Then Alexander saw it, a gap opening in the Persian left as Darius committed cavalry to pressure his flanks. He drove straight through it, again directly for Darius. The Persian king broke, fled the field. His massive army collapsed in confusion and panic, folding inward on itself. The Persian Empire had just lost its heart. Alexander marched into Persepolis, the Persian capital, and burned the royal palace. Some say it was deliberate revenge for Xerxes burning Athens a century before. Some say it was a drunken knight that went too far. Darius was later found murdered by his own nobles, a fugitive king, killed by the men who once served him. Alexander reportedly wept when he found the body. He ordered a royal burial with full honors. He was 25 years old. He had conquered the largest empire in the world. He kept going.
Egypt welcomed him like a liberator. The Persians had been hated rulers. They desecrated temples, mocked local gods, ruled with contempt. Alexander did the opposite. He entered the temples. He showed reverence. He sacrificed to Egyptian gods with the same sincerity he showed the Greek ones. The priests of Memphis declared him pharaoh, not a conqueror, a king, a divine ruler descended from the gods. Alexander did not resist this idea. He founded a new city on the Egyptian coast, Alexandria, laying out the streets himself, scattering grain across the ground to mark where the walls would rise. The city would become, within decades, the greatest center of learning and commerce in the Mediterranean world. Its library would hold 500,000 scrolls. It would define civilization for centuries. But there was something Alexander wanted even more than Egypt's riches. He traveled west into the Libyan desert to the oasis of Siwa, a journey of weeks through brutal terrain, to consult the oracle of Amun, the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus, the highest divine authority in the region. What the oracle told him in private, Alexander never revealed. He wrote only that he received the answer his heart desired. What we know is what he said afterward. He told his companions the god had called him son, son of a god. Whether Alexander believed it himself, whether it was strategy or faith or something in between, it changed him. The distance between the king and his men grew. He began adopting Persian dress, Persian customs. He asked his companions to prostrate themselves before him, as Persians did before their king. His Macedonians refused. They were free men. They bowed to no one, not even him. The friction was beginning, but Alexander was not done. He marched east, always east, through the mountains of Afghanistan, through the scorching deserts of Bactria, through passes that would defeat armies for centuries to come. He founded cities everywhere he went, always named Alexandria, dozens of them. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, in a genuine love match that surprised everyone around him. He fought guerrilla wars in terrain that broke conventional armies. He kept winning. And then he crossed into India. 326 BC, the Punjab region.
King Porus waited for him on the far bank of the Hydaspes River with an army that included 200 war elephants. The Macedonians had never faced elephants in battle before. The great gray creatures towered over everything. They could trample formations. They could scatter cavalry. They were the ancient world's tanks. Alexander spent days fainting, keeping Porus guessing, before crossing the river at night in a thunderstorm, a violent, lightning-cracked crossing that should have been impossible. He emerged on the bank, formed his lines, and engaged. The Battle of Hydaspes was the hardest fight of his career. His beloved Bucephalus died that day, from exhaustion, not wounds. He was already old. Alexander founded a city at the battlefield and named part of it Bucephala, after the horse he had tamed as a boy. He stood at the Hydaspes, and he looked east. There were more kingdoms there, larger armies, more rivers to cross. He could see it all, the rest of the map. He had almost certainly heard of the great civilization to the east that Greeks called the land beyond the rivers. He wanted all of it. His army said no. Not in those words. They didn't openly defy him, not at first. They went quiet. Men who had marched 15,000 miles over 11 years stood in their tents and stared at nothing. Some wept. Some had not seen their homes or families since they were boys. They were broken, not by the enemy, but by time, by distance, by rain and heat and a march that never seemed to end. His generals told him, his officers told him. Finally, his men simply would not move. Alexander retreated to his tent for 3 days. He tried everything: appeals, anger, silence, promises. Nothing worked. The army would go no further. He had never been defeated in battle, but here, at the edge of everything, the conqueror of the world was stopped by the one thing no sword could cut through: human exhaustion. He ordered the march west. He never led them east again. He reached Babylon in 323 BC. He had plans, always more plans, a campaign around Arabia, perhaps Africa, the Western Mediterranean. His mind never stopped. His body had begun to. Babylon's priests warned him not to enter the city. The omens were terrible. He entered anyway. In late May, after a banquet, he developed a fever. At first, nothing alarming. Conquerors get fevers. He carried wounds from a dozen battles, an arrow through his lung in India that should have killed him, a blade to the skull at Granicus, ribs cracked, a leg nearly destroyed. His body had been damaged in ways that would have ended most men years before. But this fever didn't break. For 11 days it climbed. He was moved to the palace. His condition deteriorated. His generals, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus, Antipater's son Cassander, gathered outside his chamber, not all of them out of concern. The soldiers demanded to see him, thousands of them, lined up outside the palace. They needed to know he was real, that he was still there. The court opened the doors. Alexander lay on his bed, too weak to speak. As his soldiers filed past him, veterans, men who had fought with him for over a decade, he raised his head. One by one he recognized them. He lifted his hand in greeting. He could not give them words, but he gave them that. It was the last time his army saw him alive. When his generals gathered around his bedside and asked who he left his empire to, the words that came from him, barely audible, whether true or apocryphal, were 3. To the strongest. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He was 32 years old,
and before his body was even cold, before the funeral arrangements had been made, his generals were already at each other's throats.
They called themselves the Diadochi, the successors. Within months, they were at war. Within years, the empire had shattered into fragments. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took Persia and the East. Antigonus fought for Greece. They slaughtered each other for decades. They killed Alexander's wife, Roxana. They killed his son. They killed his mother. They erased almost everyone who had ever had a legitimate claim to what he built. In less than 50 years, the unified empire Alexander spent his entire life creating no longer existed. So what was it all for? Here is what I believe. Alexander never built an empire designed to last. He built momentum. He built mythology. Every city he founded, every battle he won, every god he claimed kinship with, it was all in service of something that couldn't be institutionalized, couldn't be delegated, couldn't be inherited. It was him, just him. The tragedy of Alexander is not that he died young. The tragedy is that everything he created depended entirely on one man continuing to exist. There was no system. There was no succession. There was only his relentless, impossible, consuming forward motion, and the moment it stopped, the whole construct began to collapse. But here is the other side of it. The cities he founded became centers of civilization for centuries. The Greek culture he spread across the Middle East and Central Asia created a fusion, Hellenism, that would shape art, philosophy, architecture, religion, and science for 1,000 years. The Silk Road, Christianity, Islam, all of these would travel through the corridors Alexander opened. He didn't just conquer geography, he rewired how civilizations would connect. A 20-year-old king with a kingdom that could have been swallowed in an afternoon became the most famous conqueror in all of human history. The man Julius Caesar wept before his statue, feeling he had accomplished nothing at the same age. The man Napoleon studied obsessively on campaign. The man whose name, in some form, is still spoken in dozens of languages, in dozens of cultures, thousands of years later. Did he build an empire? Yes, and it died with him. Did he build a legend? You're still watching. 2,300 years later. I think you already know the answer. To enjoy more historical stories like this, like, subscribe, and share. This has been Ages of War.